Welcome. We come to the second hour of the second part of my analysis of the Pentagon's brain, and I apologize that this took longer than expected. I'm on the road, and I had several other shows to do and prepare for, and I was also at the same time reading this 500-page book, so I did finally get it done, and I thank you all for your patience. I hope you guys know that if sometimes an analysis is a little late, it's not because I'm being lazy or slacking. It's almost always because there's so much to do, and I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it is a lot of work. So reading these books, keeping up on this material, working through these 500-page books is very tedious. It's very exhausting as well, and so sometimes I can't get it knocked out as soon as I would like to when I have, the other half of my job, which is to go on shows and promote the material. So thank you for being patient with me that I was a little bit behind on this, but I did finally get it done. And we want to pick up with where Andy Jacobson was talking about Vietnam, and then Vietnam not being a success in terms of the public understanding of the war. But Vietnam was a success when it comes to Darpa and Darpa's high-level experiments that were being done during Vietnam. Now, she goes on to talk about Moore's Law, which is, of course, the idea that technology advances at such a rate that it really can't, it basically doubles every year. And that eventually this will come to some kind of nexus point. In 2014, she mentions Apple has 2 billion transistors in the iPhone 6. So that's an example of Moore's Law coming to fruition with the immense complexity of the iPhone. Now, the internet is then what comes into being in the 60s with ARPANET, DARPANET, and it's a few universities. It's at Stanford Research, MIT. They start transmitting packets of information. You're probably familiar with that. Most people have heard something to that effect when it comes to the history of the internet. But it's important to point out that this didn't develop in a vacuum. It develops out of a lot of the experiments done in Vietnam, particularly the idea of the electronic fence and the idea of smart bombs and sensors and essentially a big system of systems that can operate autonomously when triggered. And so the information, when a sensor goes off, right, it triggers and sends a code or a signal to some other location to explode the bomb or to drop the bomb from the drone or whatever it might be. So smart weapons, smart bombs, surface-to-air missiles comes out of Vietnam, and those all develop in tandem with the internet. It's precisely because the internet was originally intended to be a means of cryptography, of sending information, packets, secretly. And so that's why we saw the drones come out of Vietnam, as well as GPS. Now, Andrew Marshall, who is written about in Wire magazine, and who was at the Rand Corporation called Yoda. Andrew Marshall is very important because he foresaw the future of the completely drone-run Air Force. And so he's kind of the brainchild of that. And this is where we get to video games. I was on the Kill Stream, which is a popular alt media red pill type show last night, and one of the questioners from the audience, the listener, said, where do you get this idea that video games had a connection to the Pentagon? Now, we've talked about that in interviews with Hoaxbusters before, but we see Jacobson here dealing with it in terms of information war and the DoD developing flight simulators right? So we're not just talking about video games in general. We're talking about the first-person shooter in particular as a development out of flight simulators by Darpa, again, all in tandem with the rise of internet and drones and smart technology. So they came up with the idea that we could have remote video games. There would be black budget money appropriate to this in the 70s, 25 million to 100 million over several decades. Well, 25 million initially, which in our day would equal 100 million to create this advanced flight simulator video game that would go from 3D and eventually to 4D, that you could have like a holographic projection, real-time imaging. And this is how I mentioned the fact that the CIA and NSA have been spying on World of Warcraft users. And then we get to the section on lasers and directed energy weapons. And if you remember my 2016 Secret Space Program conference talk, I talked about directed energy weapons and lasers being mentioned very early on in all of the Fleming stories. Well, not all of them, but certain ones, like the movie version of Man with a Golden Gun. And she talks about the Star Wars Defense Initiative and Alexei Tolstoy's 1926 novel, The Gagarin Death Ray. So Tolstoy's science fiction story in 1926 influenced a lot of the founders, Charles Towns, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics for lasers. He got the inspiration for that from the science fiction Tolstoy story. Now, she doesn't mention Tesla, but Tesla had a lot of the same ideas, right, earlier than this Charles Town character. But of course, I don't know that Tesla necessarily created a laser, but we have the same rough idea with electromagnetic experimentation. But it's actually the Star Wars Defense Initiative, SDI, Reagan's SDI, that I mentioned in my Secret Space Program talk. You can go back and watch that. That is vindicated. In other words, the material that I talked about there is vindicated here in Annie Jacobson's book. So everything that I was kind of hinting at in that lecture is dealt with extensively here in her book, and particularly the idea of low Earth orbit satellite Skynet type stuff, right? So I talked a lot about Skynet in that talk. I talked a lot about Skynet in my Alternative View 9 talk that I just did about a month ago. And again, this book backs it up. And then simultaneously with all this is the development of simulant world systems, SimNet, and virtual worlds. And this would be, she calls it virtual worlds, virtual weapons, a way to have real-time imaging and tracking of events. So basically, whatever's going on anywhere, sort of a super advanced Google Maps, Google Satellite. And this is the plan of CENTCOM and DARPA. So this stuff is really done. She doesn't go into a lot of depth about that because we don't really know, right? A lot of that's still probably classified. But back in the 90s, in 1990, she has that quote that I tweeted out of Norman Schwarzkopf, General Schwarzkopf, talking about how in 1990 they had a simulation that ran in a video game system that CENTCOM ran. CENTCOM's SimNet simulation of the Iraq War was, according in the words of Norman Schwarzkopf, eerily similar, right? Eerily paralleled the imaginary scenario of the game. So when they went into when they had the real world, the real war in Iraq, it eerily paralleled the video game simulation. So then the next chapter in the Gulf War theater, we got new smart missiles being tested out, Tomahawk missiles. It was actually DARPA that developed Tomahawk missiles. Drone warfare again comes into play like Vietnam. The introduction of stealth surface-to-air missiles, the introduction of airborne platforms called the J-Stars, which did real-time surveillance over vast battlefields. So basically a giant airborne drone platform. And so what we're seeing again is that these big wars, and even these smaller wars, basically function not just as ideas for or fair game for oil interests, or for the expansion of, say, Israeli foreign policy or something like that. Because like if you talk to the average anti-war person, it's all about oil and money. If you talk to the critic of Zionism, it's all about Israeli foreign policy, right? This is something like Ryan Dawson's always saying. Ryan Dawson says, "Oh no, the only thing that matters is the Israeli foreign policy." But there's even a deeper level that they don't talk about, which is these theaters of war are test beds, giant lab experiments for Darpa and these kinds of entities, right? For John Poindexter, for total information awareness, for how to create the most efficient technocratic system for the domestic population. That's what this is really about in the coming technocracy, right? So it's not just about oil and destabilization in the Middle East, right? It's also about the future conflict with people opposing the world government that's to be brought in, quite literally. It may sound extreme, that may sound crazy, but let's consider where she talks about terrorism and counterinsurgency. So everything that you hear in the last 20 or 30 years about the counterinsurgency, okay, this begins with the guerrilla warfare, asymmetrical warfare, Viet Cong, right? They were counterinsurgent, quote, terrorists. Then Rand comes up with a plan that religious extremism in the future will be the real threat. The counterinsurgents of religious terrorist organizations, which is exactly what the Cold War transitions into, right? Out of the Ruskies and the Reds into terror. And isn't it interesting that Rand just magically had this? They magically knew all this. How did they have such a crystal ball? Oh, maybe it's because the CIA runs the terrorist. Maybe that's why they knew that Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen would fight for the interests of the CIA. And so then we get to this very interesting chapter that I didn't expect on bioweapons. Now, why is all this interesting? You're like, why are you talking about this, Jay? Well, listen to, if you didn't hear the interview that I did with Mark Hackard from Soul to East, my friend, on the Skripal affair, the UK Skripal affair, right, of the Russian defectors who were supposedly poisoned by Novichok, this mysterious James Bond style poison agent that we don't actually know for sure if that exists or not. But this story is curiously parallel to the defector story of Peseshnik and Alabek. The defectors in the 90s, early 90s defectors, Dr. Kanashian Alebekov and Dr. V, or is it, he meant to be a doctor, what is he, Peseshnik. Anyway, the point is that these are bioweapons guys from Russia, and they reveal that the great secret that the Ruskies were planning wasn't just the nukes, that they were going to nuke everybody in the West, but the Russians had a giant biowarfare plan that they were going to bioweapon annihilate everyone. The zombie virus, the T virus from Resident Evil, was going to be released, and the program was called Biopreparat. according to these defectors. Now, how many times have we talked about that you can't trust defectors because the so-called information that's leaked from the defectors is precisely what the CIA wants them to leak. So they're very useful for that in that regard. And then after that information has served its purpose, they're not really useful anymore. So Vladimir Pasechnik and Albikov, interestingly enough, are quoted as they end up writing books. And I was looking at some of these books on Amazon, and they just curiously parallel with books written by Robin Cook, the famous doctor who writes about, virus and what's that Jamie Lee Curtis movie and the Dustin Hoffman movie, and Robin Cook wrote Coma that Michael Crichton directed, which I did get a chance to watch. But Robin Cook comments on the books by these guys. And so they're all just Cold Warriors rehashing this Cold War stuff. And who knows if this giant Russian bioweapon attack was even real. It could just be made up. Just like the Skripal affair could be made up. And Andy Jacobson goes on to say, well, what did all this mean? Well, basically, under the auspices of the fact that the Russians are going to release the Resident Evil T virus on everybody, it created a giant new market, and billions of dollars were appropriated to this new anti-bioweapons containment program. And that was because the Russians were going to release the super plague. You can't make this up. Page 293, these so-called defectors, Alibek and Pasechnik, told British intelligence that the Russians had advanced biotechnology and they were going to release the, quote, super plague. The top secret unit of the biopreparat of the Russians was called the Biological Group. And Operations Directorate was about to release the SS-18 Satan missile. I'm not joking. NATO claimed that the Soviets were going to release the super plague, quite literally the Resident Evil T virus, on the Satan missile, the SS-18 Satan missile system, according to NATO. Are you starting to realize that this has a lot of parallels to the weapons of mass destruction story? Yeah, well, yes, it does. Because they just rehash the same stories over and over. And then we're told that there's going to be a GMO apocalypse, genetically modified apocalypse, because of all this Russian crap. And the thing is, how are we supposed to believe these people that constantly lie, right? I mean, these are the people behind Vietnam, same people. And Vietnam was premised on the false flag incident of the Gulf of Tonkin. And we're supposed to believe that, the same people behind the weapons of mass destruction lie of Iraq, same people behind the bogus nonsense of 9/11. Same lies over and over and over. But we're supposed to believe that the Russians are going to release the T virus that's going to kill everybody. And the only way that we can stop that is to create a giant billion-dollar anti-bioweapon program, which, it's just going to have to also experiment on humans and Americans as well, right? Yeah, sorry. That's just part of how we have to fight the Russians. Unbelievable. It's unbelievable, really, when you think about it. In 1996, the CIA provided President Clinton with reports on bioweapons. The bioweapons program existed in Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, and Russia, and North Korea. Wouldn't you know it? The bioweapons program just happens to exist, not just in Russia, but in all of the countries that America wants to invade. Now, who was in the background of this? The CIA, Stanford Research Institute, the Navy, NASA, Department of Energy, the Defense Nuclear Agency, the National Science Foundation, the MITRE Corporation, Jason scientists, Gordon MacDonald, all of the same suspects. After the Berlin Wall came down, the bioweapons threat was ratcheted up. The Jason scientists, that's the secret society of scientists, remember, was told that it would be wise to bring biologists into the ranks. And so they started reaching out to, get this, who do you think they contacted? A higher up at McDonald's. Or no, excuse me. A higher up at McDonald's reached out to DARPA, excuse me. So going from McDonald's, fake food, directly to DARPA, bioweapons, are you starting to see a pattern here? Now, this is interesting. I wasn't expecting this, but she admits the SV40 virus stuff is true, although she doesn't admit that it was a conspiracy, even though we know it was, because Maurice Hillerman is on the video, as well as some of the other doctors, saying that they intentionally put the simian virus into the vaccine. And they laugh about it. And you can find that clip. It's not hard to figure it out. Yet we're told by Snopes and other sites that that is not true. It's supposedly been debunked, even though there's videos of the scientists and the doctors talking about doing it and laughing about it. I've included it in talks that I've done. So this would seem to vindicate the book that my publisher puts out, Dr. Mary's Monkey, which is about the SV40 vaccine, right? Which ties into Salk. If you heard my talks on Jonas Salk, right? Go listen to those if you didn't. Survival of the Wisest. Are you starting to see the pattern here? The people that are running this stuff are the same as the people behind the Salk Institute, Jonas Salk, right? And they're technocratic, Luciferian eugenicists. She's even going to quote some of these guys, essentially saying the same thing. If you remember the Salk talk, if you remember the Kessler talk, and if you remember the Bertrand Russell talk, they all talked about how we could commandeer evolution. And commandeering evolution doesn't just mean, oh, let's, create helpful, advantageous technology for human beings going into the future. No, it means forcing mankind to undergo stressors such as mass cancer, mass vaccination that is damaging, to supposedly initiate the next stage of evolution, causing mankind to speed up the evolution by subjecting man to extremely unhealthy, extreme conditions that the body's not meant to undergo. But see, this is why Darwinism is so dangerous. That's what drives these lunatics. And they all believe Darwinism. There's not none of them question it. This is why you can't, all of these people, right, talking in circles and arguing in circles and talking about the alt-right and talking about how they're going to fix things with this and that and all these dumb movements and all these dumb political things. Nothing is going to work until you go after Darwinism, because Darwinism is the overall underlying presupposition and worldview behind all of these systems. And that's what no one questions. Well, I mean, I do, and others in my circle of friends, we question it. But most of the people out there do not. In 1994, an international nonfiction bestseller called The Hot Zone by Richard Preston about the origins of the Ebola virus scared President Clinton. And President Clinton set up more sci-fi gobbledygook money to be allocated to the anti-Black Death plague that the Russians were going to put on the warhead. I'm not joking. That's pages 300 to 301. And a lot of people have read this Hot Zone book. I remember when it was out. It's a pretty popular sci-fi novel. And then there's another book called, in 1997, he wrote another one called The Cobra Event, The Cobra Virus. You can't make this up. Literal G.I. Joe level shit. I'm not joking. The Cobra Virus? Give me a break. Remember like 2 years ago, or no, it was a year ago, year and a half, when Ebola was about to break out, and Alex Jones was going crazy and saying Ebola, and none of it was true. None of it. It was all baloney. So basically, the anti-Russian propaganda has just continued. It never really stopped. It just kind of comes in and out of fashion. And on page 303, we have, again, very similar stories to the Skripal affair and the Novichok affair. It's almost like they just rehashed this stuff from then. And in 1999, the defectors, here's how it plays into 9/11 and weapons of mass destruction. The defectors said that the terrorists, now not the Russians, but that the Russians were going to supply the terrorists with weapons of mass destruction, i.e. bioweapons. So in 1999, the WMD myth was connected to the supposed supplying of bioweapons by the Russians. Did not know that. That was an interesting angle. I did not know. By the way, it also ties into the false flag anthrax tales, if you remember those, around 9/11. Yes, those false flag anthrax tales were not Russians. They were not Russian-supplied Al-Qaeda operatives. Those strains, if those stories are true, come from U.S. high-level bioweapons labs. They didn't come from Russia. Next, Iron Man. Transforming humans, transformers, transhumanists, transvestites, and yes, that all relates. Chapter 18, Iron Man. Yes, the creation of an exoskeleton super soldier suit. Now, you say that super soldier crap, which is a large part of the latter seasons of the X-Files, is not true, Jay. Why are you talking about this stuff that is just not true? It's science fiction gobbledygook. Actually, it is true. I don't know how advanced the Darpa suits and exoskeletons are, but it's true. And on page 308, she says that the transhumanists at Darpa, yes, transhumanists, that's the word that's used in the book, have the intention to control evolution and to speed it up. Isn't that what I told you? Well, yes, it is. Everything I've been telling you is true. And who is this McDonald's character? Michael Goldblatt, a biologist and venture capitalist who worked with nutrition at McDonald's. Yes, you heard me right. You didn't know there was such a thing? Well, there's not. Anti-nutrition at McDonald's. And he calls DARPA and says, I have invented self-sterilizing food packages. What? And he says even though DARPA wasn't interested in that, DARPA was interested in other ideas, such as the injection of nanotechnology into soldiers, the creation of soldiers who could hibernate, the creation of soldiers who did not need sleep. Once again, X-Files, believe it or not. Yes, if you remember, I think it's season 3 or 4, there are Vietnam vets who have been put into mind control programs to remove the need for sleep. I'm starting to think that might actually be real. It's not just an X-File. Now, I'm not saying that they actually achieved that, but I'm sure that it messed the people up that they experimented on. Now, why would you even think that you could do this? This is so retarded. Obviously, beings need sleep. Humans are not bears. They're not made to hibernate. This is how dumb this stuff is, how kooky it is. But if you don't believe that nature's created and that nature has purpose within it, then you would think you could create humans to hibernate. Humans aren't made to hibernate. You're not going to change human DNA and biology to where they hibernate. That's just lunacy. By the way, you say, well, aren't they making all these advances? No, they're not. I mean, individuals make advances based on, their specific niches and disciplines, but you can't demonstrate that Darwinism is what gives people the ability to make these scientific advances, precisely because plenty of scientists and engineers and computer scientists who make advances aren't Darwinists, right? So really, making the advances is not predicated on Darwinism. And this is the chapter where we get into some of the heavy-duty, hardcore conspiracy stuff, the brain implants, and they are real. Now, obviously, even some of this is still classified, so we don't know to what degree and to what extent the brain implants have the ability to do XYZ. But she does say that this is part of the super soldier program, page 312. And that the brain implants, the microchips, they come out of the plans that were related to long-term Fort Detrick mind control programs. In other words, MKUltra. Now, keep in mind, she mentioned MKUltra earlier in the book under the BS of what the CIA accused the commies of doing, right? The Manchurian Candidate style, commies are brainwashing people nonsense. But when she gets to this part of talking about the implantable microchips, she does not mention MKUltra, even though it is MKUltra. Because even though MKUltra was shut down, Project Monarch, this kind of stuff, the sub-projects, it just, as we know from John Marks's book, became MK Search and moved to Fort Detrick, the bioweapons place. Now, you say, well, how do we get to implantable microchips? Jose Delgado. Dr. Delgado, who wrote Physical Control of the Mind, is the pioneer of sticking the the electrodes and brain implants into the bulls, and presumably, we don't know, but presumably these same programs into the soldiers. It's the exact same program. So that's your linking factor there. So everything I've been telling you is not conspiracy material. It's true. And I'm connecting dots that even she doesn't connect because she hasn't read all these other materials. She's just going by her public sources that she has. And she's going to, by the way, in the last chapter, talk about going to the Pentagon and getting the declassified information that she could. Guess who else went? Chris Carter and Gail Ann Hurd of Terminator fame. So Annie Jacobson goes to the Pentagon with Chris Carter of X-Files and Gail Ann Hurd, the producer with James Cameron of Terminator. And that's how they know what's going on. They're in meetings with Darpa, Pentagon, military industrial complex people, and they're told this kind of stuff to be put in the fiction and in their books. And anyway, so then we come to what I mentioned on Sunday Wire, this giant war game called Dark Winter that took place in 1990, I think. And this is kind of unbelievable because it's this big scenario of giant terror attacks by Al-Qaeda, 1990, except that it's not, get this, it's not the like 9/11 style stuff. It's Al-Qaeda does a big bioweapon anthrax attack. Oh, well, isn't that interesting? Because on 9/11, 11 years later, after 1990's Dark Winter war game, Al-Qaeda does launch an anthrax attack, supposedly. Didn't they? Supposedly. If all that's true. According to the mainstream source. So we were told, right? Remember Condoleezza Rice? We had no idea that Al Qaeda could do such a thing as bomb the buildings and do the no, there were war games about the towers being hit. There were war games about drills, about all these things. And get this, didn't know this till I read this book, war games about the anthrax attack. So the story that they had no idea what was coming is utter and complete baloney. But this, by the way, is how the CIA, George Tenet, tried to tie the Russians to bin Laden. Former CIA director George Tenet reported to the National Security Agency, reported that the NSA had just received a call from bin Laden to one of his deputies. Okay, this is like at 10 a.m. on 9/11. To one of his deputies of the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, discussing the good news that the terror strikes had been successful. And this is a call that is made to Rumsfeld. So Rumsfeld and Cheney are on the phone. Cheney is at Site R, Raven Rock. Rumsfeld's at the Pentagon. And George Tenet of the CIA calls, supposedly, Rumsfeld to tell him that bin Laden called somebody from the Soviet Republic of Georgia about the good news. In other words, the Soviets were aiding bin Laden on 9/11. The evil Russian. Come on. This is what, of course, leads to the tenuous, made-up bullshit connection of Saddam Hussein to Osama bin Laden with Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz. The connection of bin Laden to Iraq, which there is none. And we all now know there was none, and it was all made up. But this brings us to the war on terror. She discusses the anthrax attack of NBC employee tested positive for anthrax October 12th, October 15th. So this is, the anthrax attacks were after, like a month after 9/11. Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle claims that there's anthrax in his office. Yeah, right. Who knows? Could be all just be made up. But it's directly parallel to the dark winter drills. Next chapter is total information awareness. This was the brainchild of John Poindexter of Darpa and Iran-Contra fame. And so this is where we get the idea of the ability to hack into CCTV cameras and to facially recognize anyone, anywhere. Oh, because of terrorists, right? So this is how we track the terrorists, even though we can't seem to track and catch any of the terrorists. They're just too sneaky. And what is the logo? Well, even Annie Jacobson says, isn't it curious that the Total Information Awareness Network's logo is the All-Seeing Eye? DARPA's TIA, All-Seeing Eye. And even though John Poindexter was convicted in regard to the Iran-Contra affair, and even though supposedly the Total Information Awareness was seen to be Orwellian and supposedly shut down, it just continues. Of course it is. Then the next chapter is actually the next two chapters are pretty boring. IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and we've got to understand how the Taliban make. Yeah, right. Give me a break. Like, it's not obvious how they make improvised explosive devices. Then we get into human terrain and the combat zones at sea. This was the brainchild of Rumsfeld. Have basically total surveillance and internet connected battlefield. And then we get to I've mentioned this in a few talks and interviews. I think I might even mention it in the first Esoteric Hollywood in the Minority Report chapter. I can't recall, but biometrics were first collected on a few million Afghanis in the Afghan war in 2002. And this was a Darpa program. Petraeus said it's going to be great to have all the biometrics of the counterinsurgents. BioInt, as it's called, biointelligence. Now, you'd say, so what? So what? They're collecting the biological information on the bad guys. No. This is to be brought here, dummy. This is to be done here. Afghan war also tested out robots. Robots on the battlefield. Robots that can go and remove the improvised explosive devices. And guess what Annie Jacobson likens this to? Guess what she connects it to? You thought we were all crazy conspiracy theorists. Oh, the Phoenix program. Why? The combat zones at sea, mapping the human domain. It just happens to be very, very well connected to the CIA's Vietnam-era Phoenix program and the CORD program, where the CIA enlisted local Vietnamese leaders to help choose the targets for assassination. The truth about the human terrain system was hidden in plain sight. It was all about human terrain, mapping the human domain and human nodes and contacts and connections. In other words, Facebook. Yes, Facebook will come out of these same ideas. Mapping the human domain. Quote, people are human networks. It's impossible to run a country or a business or anything without controlling resources and geography and networking. No one person can control anything of any significance. People have to network. Therefore, we need a way to track and watch networks, affiliates, affiliations, connections. Who is friends with who? And then she talks about the rise of ISIS. But yes, keep in mind, that is exactly what Facebook is. It's what the internet is. Then she talks about the Snowden leaks of the PRISM program, all of which is well known. We all knew that. That wasn't even new information. Anybody that listened to Alex Jones or read James Bamford's book knew about that stuff at least 10 to 15 years before Snowden. Then we come to drone wars, that the future of warfare will be drones. She talks about the typical creation of the cyborg, which is an actual plan, what DARPA calls biohybrids. There will be biohybrids. There will be unmanned drones. There will be killer insects. Yes, insect drones that kill. Not a conspiracy theory. Beetle drones that hover over doorways and sneak into palaces to spy. Yes, that's what she says. And the eventual creation of the artificial brain, which was the original concept from John von Neumann, right? Then we come to the all-important chapter of the brain chips once again, and she goes into a little more detail in this chapter about brain chips being used on soldiers with PTSD. So here we are back to PTSD, which is originally studied at Tavistock in the wake of World War I, which led to MK Ultra, right? Studying PTSD. It's Tavistock that gave you the idea of PTSD. So how do we need to map the human brain, mapping the human mind? So it's not just mapping the human domain and total domination of the human domain. It's also the inner domain, mapping the human mind and its neural networks itself. And this is done through a lot of different experiments. DARPA's testing the injection of restoring active memory. So in other words, RAM, like sticking RAM in your head. Tiny machines, nanotechnology implanted in the brain. There's a whole bunch of programs. RAM, repair, remind. And guess what else it also does? It can also wipe out your memories. Well, isn't that helpful? And that I did include in Esoteric Hollywood in the Blade Runner section. So basically, yeah, we're looking at Blade Runner. We're looking at the replicants here. And if you remember, the replicants have implanted memories. And oh yes, that's all true. That's all possible, supposedly, according to Jacobson. And one of the projects that DARPA is working on is an actual human eye, to create a computerized eye that will work as good as the eye. But it's very difficult, they say. Now, how many times have I talked about this stuff being alchemy? People say, ha ha ha, you're an idiot, it's not alchemy. Well, Darpa is studying salamanders because of their regeneration properties. Now, old alchemists would talk about studying salamanders because they would have the secret of regeneration. So here's Darpa saying the exact same thing that the ancient alchemists said about salamanders. So maybe I'm more right than even I know, because even I was surprised to say that. Well, then she talks about mutations and the experiments done on people who have mutations, you know, from exposure to something like radioactive material, right? Well, the spraying of Agent Orange supposedly created weird mutations, and that just happens to be an experiment, and it's all part of evolution, she says. She says, the DARPA people say. So the Agent Orange children were born with mutations, and it had to do with the spraying. What? And I got to thinking, well, that sounds like Morgellons, doesn't it? Now, I don't know if Morgellons is connected to chemtrails per se, but there are strange mutations that do relate to spraying, and they've known this since Vietnam. So you think they haven't advanced their nanotech and spraying technology since Vietnam, and you think they wouldn't do the same thing? Of course they would. And I mean, these are lunatic people. In fact, she even talks about Haeckel-style ontogeny, right, which has been debunked. But she's quoting some DARPA guy, Gardner, at the cellular level. It says, people regenerate. Look at how we all started ab initio. We were all a single-cell organism. Once upon a time, each of us was in our mom's womb, a one-celled embryo that divided. Every human being on this planet regenerates his or her own cells in the womb. Well, first of all, okay, that's partly true, but the connection between human beings being single-celled organisms in terms of evolution is not true in comparison to humans in the womb. In other words, you can't argue that because humans in the womb start out as zygote, that therefore all of humanity began as an evolving zygote, right? That's Ernst Haeckel's ontogeny, and that's been debunked, and even the modern Darwinists don't believe in ontogeny. But no matter, we'll just keep believing that. Then we get into cloning. DARPA's interest in cloning, and we aren't really told much about cloning because, as she says of the DARPA scientists, whatever cloning programs are going on are classified, but yes, the government will clone people, and they'll just do it in secret. And not just the government, corporate interests too. Doesn't matter whether it's, quote, government or corporate. Now, whether they'll be successful is a different question. How far they're successful in this is a different question. If you saw the mouse with the ear on his back, that's actually very deceptive. If you read the story of, scientists grow a human ear on a mouse's back, that's not actually true. What happened was they took ear collagen or whatever, and they stuffed it into the back of a mouse and sewed it up, and it stayed there. So they claimed that they had, quote, grown an ear on the back. That's the public story. Go read about it. Because I double-checked that because I thought this could be science bullshit, right? And it was. It's not. They didn't grow a human ear onto the back of a mouse. But, of course, Time Magazine put that on the front and said they did. No, the collagen was inserted into the back of the mouse. Then she ends this chapter with talking about the T-2000, Terminator. Yep. So we want to create the Terminator. That's what they say. Then she talks about how many of these things were inspired by science fiction, how many times they've consulted from science fiction futurist writers, the Pentagon has. Yeah, exactly. So this is basically a vindication of everything Jay's analysis has talked about. This is a vindication of my book, Esoteric Hollywood. The Pentagon consults with science fiction writers. The Pentagon also tells science fiction writers information on DARPA technology. And then they go and write the X-Files. They go and write their books. This is what Jay's analysis has been talking about. And yet I'm still called a conspiratard at times. So she goes with Chris Carter and Gail Ann Hurd to the Pentagon. They meet with Pentagon people who think it's funny that the X-Files has the cigarette smoking man. One of the Pentagon people that she doesn't mention has a poster of the cigarette smoking man. And AUGCOG, Augmented Cognition, is a big program, as we said, of the biohybrids, and supposedly we're told the cyborgs are real. We're not told how real they are, but supposedly they're real. And then we get into all the money that was appropriated to the Salk Institute under Obama, and that is a DARPA program. Of course it is, the Brain Initiative, as we've talked about before at Jay's Analysis. And this is the story of the Batman shooter, right? James Holmes was involved in this program. To what degree, we don't know. We don't know all the details, but yes, he was giving a talk about human brain-computer interfaces. Was he part of these mind control projects? Could be. In fact, I could see that guy volunteering for a brain chip, and then I could see a bunch of psycho generals flipping his brain chip on. I mean, you know what I mean? You know, who knows? That's obviously highly speculative, but here's her mainstream book saying all that's real. That doesn't necessarily mean it is, but you know, it could be that that's what the CIA and DARPA want us to believe. So again, we don't know. I don't know how far advanced the brain control chips are. Then she talks about a whole program dedicated to shaping the narratives. Dr. Paul Zak is the head of the DARPA and CIA initiative to create trust narratives, narrative networks, and steering the narrative amongst networks of people online, etc., etc. Dr. Paul Zak says that he claims he's discovered the neurochemical root of trust. And since he's done this at Harvard in his postdoctoral training, neuroimaging, he said, I've discovered the brain's morality. There are molecules for morality. That's so goofy this guy is. How silly it is. Physicalism. Radical physicalism with the absurd identification of morality with certain molecules in the brain. And he says it's oxytocin. That's the brain's moral molecule. And once we wipe that out, we can erase fear and control people. So quite literally, the conspiracy theory that, you know, Alex and people have talked about for a long time, that the Pentagon and DARPA have developed vaccines and targeted nanotech or whatever to go into the brain and wipe out the section of the brain related to morality. DARPA claims that's true. And the people behind this are all high-level military-industrial complex people. Unbelievable. So there you have it. It ends with the dystopian warning of targeting the brain's section of the brain that deals with morality. Now, I'm not saying that, I mean, you can give somebody a lobotomy and it turns them into a zombie, and then you could say, we fixed him. He no longer has the inclination to steal. He no longer has the inclination to rape or whatever. So we fixed him. We gave a lobotomy. And this is essentially just another version of lobotomy. And they're acting like, we've discovered the soul, and which is a molecule. We've identified it with a molecule. It's absurd. But that's the religious commitment that these people have to materialism, to Darwinism, and to physicalism. And isn't it interesting, because it doesn't end with that, and the nihilism that would lead to logically. No. It ends in a religious commitment to transhumanism, to the idea that we, the elite, will merge with machines and live in immortality, and we'll become cyborgs and all this nonsense, and everybody else will die off, and we'll have it. That's essentially what you get from this book, right? She does talk about that stuff. So what began with atomics, and the atomic age, and DARPA studying atomics and the Manhattan Project, leads to the total renovation of the biosphere plan, right, which echoes the great work of the ancient alchemists and the Hermeticists, into Luciferian transhumanism. So it's all true, and I was right about every bit of it. And there you have a mainline establishment book, Pulitzer nominee, on the history of DARPA, Pentagon's brain. And we covered 500 pages. So thank you very much for going along with me on this journey. It was dystopian, but don't worry, don't fear, because these people will be made fools, right? Think of Star Wars. What's the message of the original Star Wars? Even if you create a giant technological terror, this Death Star, the power of the Death Star is insignificant compared to the power of God. You thought I was going to say the Force. No, we don't believe in impersonal forces. We believe in personal God. So don't worry about the Pentagon and their supposed super soldier nonsense. All the people that think that they're going to get the immortality are going to die. Just like David Rockefeller died, just like Zbigniew Brzezinski died, and all their technocratic trust gained them absolutely nothing. Did it? No, it didn't. So you've been listening to Jay's Analysis. Thank you very much. Thank you again for your patience in me taking a little bit longer this time. It was a long book. Had a lot of information, but a lot of new insights, a lot of new dots connected that we didn't have connected before. And again, it vindicates my book. It vindicates Esoteric Hollywood. So I'll definitely be citing Pentagon's Brain and Esoteric Hollywood too, just because it's so relevant, especially to the mind control and transhumanist chapters that will be in the new book. But God bless and have a good evening.